We'll be joined by former Senator Heidi Heitkamp and MSNBC's Joy Reid on the dramatic vote in the Senate today in which more Republican senators turned against President Trump than ever before. The Republican-controlled Senate dealt President Trump a stinging defeat today, voting to end the president's national emergency declaration at the southern border. Donald Trump and his White House staff worked hard to pressure Republicans before the vote, and they actually did manage to turn around one Republican senator who very publicly had declared and put it in writing that he would vote against the president. But one was not enough. 12 Republican senators voted against the president and helped the Democrats win the vote 59-41. Here is a sample of Republican senators who voted against the president today.
Never before has a president asked for funding, the Congress has not provided it, and then the president has used the National Emergencies Act of 1976 to spend the money anyway.
The use of national emergency powers to circumvent Congress's explicit decision on funding is unprecedented. No president's ever used what's called the National Emergencies Act in this way.
A spending request was designated as an emergency only if the need for spending met a five-part test. It had to be necessary, sudden, urgent, unforeseen, and not permanent. His decision to fund a border wall through a national emergency declaration would never pass all of this five-part test.
After the vote, the president tweeted that he looked forward to vetoing the resolution. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said this is not an emergency, and the Congress has declared in a strong bipartisan voice that the president's fear-mongering doesn't make it one. It was the second time in 2 days that the Senate Republicans voted against the president. Yesterday, 7 Republican senators voted with the Democrats to end U.S. military support for Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen. And the House of Representatives saw the kind of vote today it hasn't seen in a long time on a matter involving President Trump. 4 Republicans voted present today, just present, but no Republicans voted against a resolution in the House of Representatives saying, quote, the report of Special Counsel Mueller should be made available to the public and to Congress. The vote for that resolution was 420-0, with 4 Republicans voting present. Today, Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer tried to bring up that same resolution in the Senate for a vote, and Republican Senator Lindsey Graham objected and blocked a vote on that resolution. Today, the president was asked if his immigration policies are cruel.
Are your immigration policies cruel?
No, I don't think they're cruel. I think they're the opposite of cruel. They become cruel because they're so ridiculous and it hurts people. It actually does the reverse of what they're supposed to be doing. But no, they're actually meant to be the opposite. And they're hurting people. They're really hurting people. A lot of people.
Is it hurting your reputation?
And I think that we have done an incredible job. We're apprehending record numbers of people.
The green you see the president wearing there today is in celebration of St. Patrick's Day, which is celebrated early in Washington and is, of course, a celebration of the history of American immigration, particularly from Ireland. NBC News' Cal Perry has once again spent the week at the southern border reporting on Trump border policies. Today, he reported from one of the places on the border that does have a wall.
Lawrence, we're here at the wall between El Paso and Juarez, and there's a new phenomenon here going on. When you talk to aid workers, they'll tell you because the Trump administration is turning migrants back at the ports of entry, what they're doing is they're coming here to this spot in the fence. Why are they coming here? Well, they're coming to apply for asylum, and they can do so quite easily because even though I'm now standing on the Mexico side of this barrier, I'm still in America. The border is, of course, the river, the halfway point between that water. So all migrants need to do to legally apply for asylum is get to this point, and Customs and Border Protection will pick them up and start processing them through centers. Once they're processed through, they're released into the city of El Paso, a city that is completely overwhelmed.
You'll see a wall that's in most parts of our county, but yet we're still receiving a record number of migrants. The status quo of processing these migrants and leaving it up to local communities to deal with the migrants and to help assist them after that, I think, is grossly unfair. We get no state assistance. We receive no other assistance from any other level of government. But I think the federal government should help communities such as El Paso.
All of this raises yet another legal question. We've been told by activists and aid workers that migrants will sometimes wait for 24 hours on the other side of that fence before Customs and Border Protection is able to pick them up and process them. By law, Customs and Border Protection should be doing it immediately. The problem with that is they're just as overwhelmed as everybody.
Leading off our discussion now is former Democratic Senator Heidi Heitkamp. She is now a fellow at Harvard's Institute of Politics. Also joining us, Joy Reid, an MSNBC national correspondent and host of AM Joy Weekends on MSNBC, and NBC News correspondent is Cal Perry is joining us from the southern border tonight. And Senator Heitkamp, I'm so glad to have you here because you were working in that Senate when just last year, when it was unimaginable that 12 Republicans would stand up and vote against this president of the United States.
Well, you say it's against the president. I like to put it this way. It's for the Constitution. Mm-hmm. It's for Article 1 powers, which is absolutely critical. And many of the people who voted that way were appropriators because they don't like being told what to do. Mm-hmm. And if you crack this egg, you can't uncrack this egg. And I think you take people like Mike Lee, who stood with his principles. Where was Ted Cruz? For 8 mm-hmm. years, or at least the 6 years I was there, Ted Cruz railed against executive encroachment on legislative authority and certainly was very critical of President Obama. He didn't stand with the Constitution today. And I really applaud my colleagues who stood with the Constitution, stood with the importance of Article 1.
Knowing them as you do, having worked with them there on the Senate floor for so many years, did you have any surprises in the way the Republicans broke today?
I thought Jerry Moran was interesting. I think that he's a great guy. I worked with him quite a bit because he represents a rural state. But I think he really stood on principle. Lamar Alexander, not a surprise. Lamar's an institutionalist. He understands that balance of power. He's retiring. Lisa and Susan, no surprise. Mm-hmm. But I really think there were a number of people like Wicker, like Moran, who really, in their gut, believe that this was a constitutional vote, a significant vote, and that the people who voted the other way will ultimately regret it. Because just like breaking the filibuster, just like going nuclear on judges, things will change, and then all of a sudden you're on the other side of it. We have to be for institutional norms, and certainly 12 Republicans today stood up for the Constitution and the institution of the United States Senate.
Joy Reid, I was on the Hill yesterday, and I had more than one Democratic senator tell me that what Senator Heitkamp just said about the ones who voted against it, many of them know in their hearts that it was the right thing to do. I had Democratic senators telling me many of them, most of them, know in their hearts it's the right thing to do, but their hearts aren't going to let them do what Donald Trump doesn't want them to do.
Right, because cowardice is like more powerful than what they know in their hearts. I mean, I'm glad that Senator Heitkamp mentioned Ted the Constitution Cruz, because what's happening here is that these senators who are voting against essentially their own power, they're not just voting against the Constitution, with all due respect to the senator, they're literally voting to diminish their own status and standing as constitutional officers. You know, the Constitution was written with the understanding that each branch of government that was equal would jealously guard their power. For somebody like Ted Cruz to call himself a constitutional originalist, but then say, go ahead, take my power. If my body says no to the president can override my body. How do they run for re-election? Saying that I'm the guy who stood for neutering the Senate. I'm the guy who stood for diminishing the power of the body that I want to serve in. It makes no sense. And I'll tell you that Cory Gardner from my home state of Colorado, the Denver Post, which shocked everyone by endorsing him, thinking he would be some sort of constitutional conservative, has just withdrawn the endorsement of him and said it was a mistake because obviously Cory Gardner cares more about the second branch of government than the first.
And Joy, you have Lamar Alexander voting against the president. He's not running for re-election in Tennessee. I guess we don't know what he would have done if he was running for re-election. And then you have Susan Collins, who is running for re-election in Maine, and she voted against the president. How do you read the Susan Collins vote?
Susan Collins is in trouble. Cory Gardner and Susan Collins are probably the two Republicans in the biggest trouble in terms of their re-elects. I see Susan Collins, sort of desperately trying to figure out this sort of line that she has to walk between being Trumpy enough to prevent herself from getting primaried, but also seeming like a normal Republican enough to get reelected. I don't see how either of the two of these guys get back in. Susan Collins can keep trying to get back in the good graces of sort of normal, moderate cloth coat Republicans. I'm not sure it works. I think about a Pat Toomey, who also seems to be trying the same thing and saying, look, no, I'm still a normal conservative. The problem is this is not a conservative Republican Party. It's the party of Trump. It's a personality cult. And you either get with the cult or you get out of Congress.
Cal Perry, you're at the border once again this week. This kind of vote has no immediate effect on anything that's happening at the border. What about life at the border as it relates to what's being talked about in the Senate or in Washington? It seems to be a pretty big disconnect.
Yeah, look, in places like El Paso, where you had 25,000 family units taken into custody in the first 4 months of 2019, as compared to 12,000 family units in all of 2018, it's crazy to think that it's a national emergency. There is certainly a humanitarian crisis going on. People here will say that up front, but it's because this administration is doing unlawful things like turning migrants away at the port of entry. So you have the President of the United States saying to a hemisphere, come to the ports of entry, enter in the correct way, and then he turns those people away. So folks are coming to the wall. They're coming to these little loophole areas where they know they have to be let in. Customs and Border Protection is now holding these people for sometimes 8, 9, 10 days. These are family units. These are mothers and fathers with their children, and they're being held in these processing centers that are just not equipped to hold them. So you have things like 30 people in a cage that's meant to hold 15. And I'm choosing my words carefully here because this administration is misleading people about the emergency that exists in this country. The Secretary of DHS, Secretary Nielsen, misled Congress when she said that these were not cages. El Paso is a safe city. Crime has not risen, even though it's become a way station for these migrants that are just trying to come, Lawrence, because the situation, frankly, in South America is deteriorating very quickly.
Senator, I always like to have Cal Perry here when we're discussing anything about the border, because these Washington discussions almost never have anything to do with the reality there. And I want to focus in on one Republican who was apparently forced, under all the pressure, to vote with the president on this. This is Thom Tillis, North Carolina, Republican, served within the Senate. He wrote a Washington Post op-ed saying there is no intellectual honesty in supporting the president's position on this. That's what he wrote last month. He said in the op-ed, as a U.S. Senator, I cannot justify providing the executive with more ways to bypass Congress. And today he changed his position on every word that he wrote in the Washington Post, and he voted with President Trump.
Well, no one's forced, first off, to vote with the president. You have to make a choice. And obviously, that's a choice that the senator from North Carolina made today. I think that he will rue the day that he did this flip-flop because, at some point, when you say I'm going to stand on principle and then nothing changes, but you change your vote, that's a really hard thing to justify at home. Because one thing I know in this era where it seems like everything's, there's so much hypocrisy in politics, that just doesn't pass the authentic smell test of doing the right thing and standing up for your principles. I think he would have been a lot better off if he had stood with his principles, but he wasn't forced by anyone. He made that choice himself.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I shouldn't use that word forced, Joy. I've seen senators pressured before, but it is not forced. They do have always have their right to vote their conscience, vote their position. But I have never, ever seen a flip-flop like this. You get the Washington Post op-ed, you put it all in writing, and then you completely flip-flop and go the other way. I don't think that's ever happened in the history of the Senate.
I mean, it's extraordinary, Lawrence, because this op-ed was supposedly a statement of principles, but obviously principles mean nothing when it comes to whether or not you are going to, turn yourself into an apparatchik, an employee of the President of the United States. That is not what a United States Senator is supposed to be. You are in a co-equal branch of government. And I have to say, beyond, Thom Tillis, I think about these senators that are from the Southwest, where I grew up. Where was Cornyn? Where was Martha McSally? If you are from Arizona, or you're from Colorado, or you're from Texas, you know that this is bogus. You know that you have to go back and face not a district. You're not in some red district in the House. You're facing a whole state where you have citizens of this country Hispanic descent who know that you're lying, who know that you are demonizing them. And you have to go back and face those people too. They can pretend they only have to face Trump voters when you get reelected, but as Senator Heitkamp knows, a senator runs in a state. You don't just run in a district. So good luck in Arizona, in Texas, in places like that, facing those voters with a lie where you decided to side with a president saying this was an emergency. Cal Perry can tell you it's not an emergency. All of our great reporters, they know it's a lie. And I think that when these senators are up for re-election, they should have to answer for that.
Joy Reid, thank you very much for starting us off tonight. Cal Perry, thank you for your input from the border. We really need that in this conversation. And Senator Heitkamp, always great to have you on a night when there's been big action in the United States Senate. Really appreciate you being here. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.